Welcome to Everyday Greatness, and thanks for listening. On this episode, we've been talking to powerful modern Australians who all just happen to be women. On today's episode, we'll speak to TWEE Giang, Volunteer Recruitment and Training Manager at the Story Factory in Redfern, a creative writing centre for young people in under-resourced communities across Sydney. TWEE is the personification of a typical modern Australian woman. She has all the kindness and care for others of a lion cub, but the heart of a full-grown lioness. Daughter of Vietnamese immigrants, she grew up in the middle of a drug epidemic in Cabramatta, where she witnessed her cousin chain himself to a bed to hold himself back from going out to find his next score. She also saw and received various degrees of racism, but she came through all of those negative forces and decided she wanted to try and help make Australia a better place. She's spent over a decade in the not-for-profit sector, developing, managing and running community-based programs such as Youth Off the Streets and She Mentors. She's done user experience design for the National Rugby League and now leads the recruitment and training arm for volunteers at the Story Factory in Redfern, an organisation that mirrors TWEE's passions in life. Like the Story Factory, TWEE's trying to use her own life experiences to help young kids from under-resourced communities have their voices, opinions and dreams heard and valued. Call her powerful, passionate, wise or strong. Call her whatever you want. But I'm going to call her a good chick. It's a real honour to welcome to Everyday Greatness, TWEE Giang. TWEE, welcome.
Wow, thank you so much, Barnaby. That was an introduction that I wasn't expecting.
I don't often call people good chicks. That's a high pedestal.
Oh, thank you.
So tell us first, how do you describe Australia from the eyes of a young, modern Australian woman of Vietnamese heritage?
No, that's a very interesting question. I think for me, I've had a really interesting relationship with Australia. I was born and I grew up in Australia, but have always kind of had an ebb and flow with Australia because I feel like I wasn't necessarily accepted here, particularly when I was growing up and when I was younger. I think that title of Vietnamese Australian is something that I have always not sure how it's sat. Sometimes I'm Australian Vietnamese, sometimes I'm Vietnamese Australian, and particularly in my early 20s, that was kind of where I was trying to find my sense of place in the world. And I think now, because there's more representation and diversity, and I see that in so many different places, I kind of feel like Australia's more accepting, but yeah, that's kind of where things are at with me.
So a lot of people know the rumours, myths and reputation of Cabramatta in its dark drug epidemic days. But what was it like growing up there as a young girl?
Yeah, so I grew up in Cabramatta during the 90s, and interestingly enough, I watched that documentary series on SBS, Once Upon a Time in Cabramatta, a few years ago, and more recently as well, and it pretty much kind of represented the experience that I had growing up. It was pretty normal to see people dealing drugs, people overdosed on the streets, syringes everywhere. And I think that was pretty much the norm growing up. That's what I expected around me, and I didn't see anything different to that. And, as you mentioned at the start, I have a very vivid memory of my cousin who was involved in gangs and heroin at that time. And he chained himself to the wall at home and asked his mum not to let him go out and get drugs because of what it was doing to him. And I saw that as, a kid, as a primary school kid, and I think that really, that kind of, is kind of, I guess, in my memory. I won't ever forget that. And I think that is representing a lot of what I saw when I grew up. And in some ways, I think was like surprised by the power of drugs and substances. And I think my parents, as a result of all that during that time, really wanted to keep us away from that and really focus on study. So that was the main focus for me as a kid. And what that meant was I kind of felt like I missed out on a childhood because my parents saw the road I could go down and didn't want us to go down that road. So, yeah, and I think actually when I went to uni after school, I actually realised how bad people said all the bad things people said about Cabramatta. I didn't really know so much because I was in that bubble there, and then I started to feel a lot of shame when I left. Went to uni at UTS, and UTS isn't that far from Cabramatta, but even an hour away, and the things that you were hearing about what people were saying about the area as well.
It's a very interesting childhood. So when you were growing up as a young girl in Cabramatta, what were your dreams? What did you want to become? Did you see your opportunities as limitless, or did you have to temper your ambition?
I think oftentimes, it's often what we see around us that can inspire us, and I don't think I saw that around me very much. I saw kind of going down the route of what my cousin was doing or studying, and at the time, I guess in some ways I was very lucky. I hung out with the nerdy kids at school. So I think that kind of kept me out of trouble in a way, and my friends were either interested in science or business, and I just kind of was like, okay, these are the two routes that are available to me, and I wasn't particularly a science kid, so I was like, I'll do business, even though I wasn't particularly drawn to it, but that felt like the only option because that's what other people were interested in. And so I kind of was like, okay, I'll study business, and I was getting, decent grades at school for that as well.
It's incredible. After such a traumatic upbringing and seeing some really traumatic things, what was it that led you to finding a career that gave back to society?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. As I mentioned, I was like, okay, I would go on to study business at uni, and I knew at the time that it didn't feel right for me. I was like, I knew for some reason that social work or social justice issues were things that I cared about, but none of my friends or people around me were interested in that. And I was also told that I should be, getting good grades, going to uni, getting a good paying job, and that was the expectation for me. So I ended up getting my first full-time job in a private education setting. And I thought that would be kind of the middle ground where it's not too corporate, but it's sort of education. But it didn't feel right for me. And so I did that for about nearly 2 years, I think, just to get enough experience under my belt. And then I was like, okay, I'm going to try to get a job in not-for-profit. And it was interesting because I think there's those times in life where you're presented with two opportunities. And so I had this opportunity to apply for a job in not-for-profit, which was a $10,000 pay cut. And at the exact same time, someone offered me a job that was $20,000 pay rise. And I was sitting there and I was like, which one do I take? And obviously you figured out which one I took. I ended up taking the $10,000 pay cut. And, that was my entry into the not-for-profit space. And I ended up working a lot of the time working with kids during this time. So working with kids of refugee background, so similar to my parents who are refugees, kids with life-threatening illnesses in Melbourne. And then, as you said, youth off the streets before finally coming to Story Factory, which is where I've been for the last 3.5 years now. So, yeah. I
know a lot of people who would have made the other choice when presented with a $20,000 pay rise.
Well, it's interesting because I was like, you know what? If it doesn't work out, at least I know that there's that option too. Because I was actually offered that job by a colleague who was setting up her own business. And she's like, it's going to be here if you want it. I was like, okay. So I think that made me feel like, okay, there could be something there if I really wanted it.
It's a very good position to be in. So you said you work at the Story Factory in Redfern.
Yeah.
There's a really interesting history for the Story Factory. Tell us a bit about the history of the place.
Yeah, so Story Factory was started by our co-founders, Kath Keenan, who's still working at Story Factory, and Tim Dick. So they opened up the Redfern Centre, which originally was called the Martian Embassy. So if you've ever visited, you'll kind of see Martian vibes in the space.
In the space.
It's funny because I think I've been there for long enough now that I forget that this is not a normal workspace to come into. Everyone walks in and thinks they're walking into kind of the skeleton of a whale. And so they started off Story Factory back in 2012, and they were inspired by the 826 National Creative Writing Centres in the United States, who had a similar model about running a creative writing centre for kids from under-resourced communities there. So Kath and Tim went over there to kind of suss out what was happening, and then came back to Sydney and was like, how can we adapt this to the model, to our local community here in Sydney? So they, consulted with educators, with youth, with teachers, with the community, and then they started off the Story Factory. And so they mainly worked in the Redfern area for the first couple of years, and then they were asked to come out to Western Sydney because there was a lot of demand there. And so then we opened up our centre in Cabramatta in 2018, and so now we run, I'd say, like 50 to 60 workshops every single week. And we're not a big organisation either, and we see about 1,400 kids. So, yeah.
Very cool. Now, TWEE, I wasn't sure whether I should use the terminology a good chick on this podcast, but I think it fits the bill perfectly. You're a very good chick. Thank you for answering my questions. Now I want to pass you on to the guru, Scott Gibbons.
Hey, TWEE. I love that Martians and the space thing. That's very, very funny. I just laughed. Hey, just stretching the other side, how did you not get involved in drugs?
I think as I was sharing that story of my cousin, I think I saw, because he would come over and ask my mum for money, and I think I just saw all those snippets in my life of where it was heading, and I didn't want to go down that path. And I think in some ways I was very lucky that my parents were a little bit strict. In hindsight, I kind of was annoyed. In hindsight, I kind of appreciated that, but I think at the time I was really annoyed that I didn't get to, be a young person and explore. But I think because I had seen what it had done to my cousin, or what it was doing to my cousin, I was just like, this is not where I want to go.
So it was you.
I guess so. Me and probably my parents in a way as well. I think my mum just kept telling me that I shouldn't be going, I shouldn't follow this path that my cousin's going down. And I think for some reason I kind of was like, okay.
And were you offered drugs?
I wasn't.
No.
It's interesting because it was around me all the time, everywhere. Coming home from school, going anywhere, people were dealing drugs on the street, And so it's interesting, I didn't feel drawn to it.
Wow. And what's the status of cousin now? What is?
I think that part of his life really affected him, and he kind of really struggled, I think, moving on with his life later on. And, now he's moved to Orange and has a place and has set up well for himself. But I think that period in his life really, he was struggling to find his place in Australia society. My parents, his auntie had come over as refugees after the war. So I think, they were working a lot and he wasn't getting the support. So he went and found support in the gangs. And so I think, wherever we are, we want to find a community of people, and he just, sadly fell into that community.
So from one side going gangs to the other side helping kids. What a divergence. Amazing.
Yeah.
Now, one of the things you said in your career was that you'd been a user experience with the NRL.
Yes.
Now, we're sitting here in the Swans Haven. So tell us, what is a user experience with the NRL?
Yeah. So user experience is about, I guess, UX is about putting a user or a customer or a person first in whatever you're designing. And so I'm doing a UX course at the moment, and one of the clients is the NRL. So that was the last project I got to work on. And it was with their grassroots My League app, which is an app for, parents, volunteers, coaches, and for them to be able to, keep track of the games for their kids and that sort of thing. So my job with the other UX designers was to go out and interview parents and coaches, find out what their frustrations were with the app, what they wanted the app to be able to do, and then design for that. So it's about, I guess, designing so that people have maybe hopefully a better experience with whatever they're using. And in some ways, I feel like that's kind of what I do, what I've done in my work, is trying to always put that person or the user or the volunteer or the kid at the forefront of everything that I do, and making sure that we design for them. Because I've worked in the community space for a long time, and you see a lot of people who have good intentions and design things, and then you're like, did you even consult with whoever you're designing for? Because do they really want this? And I think that's always been a frustration of mine, is we always put them last when we're working for them.
Yeah, good you. You're a nice person. You're nice.
Thank you.
So what would tempt you to leave the world of niceness
Yeah.
and go back into the commercial world of being paid the bigger bucks?
That's an interesting question. I definitely have thought a lot about it because I think growing up, my parents kept asking me why I was working for not-for-profit. They just said, "TWEE, you're not making very much money." And I said, yes, I know I'm not making much money. But you know what they taught me, though, is that they taught me because, we grew up and we didn't have very much. So they taught me, I think, in a way, how to make money go further. So I feel like in some ways that helped me in terms of working for not-for-profit. But I think, I've always had a very strong drive or passion for social justice issues. And so I think that's always driven me before money. Like that's why that when I had two amounts of money on the table at one point in time, I chose less money because I think at the end of the day, you can't buy that experience of being able to help someone and to do something that gives me so much.
Yeah.
I think I get value from that.
So did that come from your parents? Was that did they inspire you in any way to become more community minded, or like when they came here?
Yeah.
What did they do? What was their work?
So my parents, they came over as refugees. They actually met in Darwin at a hostel. So my dad came when he was accepted as a refugee. He came over by plane, and my mum came over by boat. And so they were both met there, and my mum, I think she worked for the Ford factory. My dad worked for a factory as well. And then they moved over to Melbourne, and then it was too cold, so then they moved up to Sydney. But it's interesting because, I don't know where it came from because they were the ones encouraging me to get out of not-for-profit.
Yeah.
To start making more money.
But there's an inspiration there somewhere.
Yeah, well, I think the thing with the Vietnamese community, there's a lot of like saving face or being proud of your children. So I think for them, they wanted to show off that, they had come through hardship and that they had, had a child who was doing well. And I think that's pretty normal in kind of migrant refugee sort of communities. And so I think, I always felt, even at school, that I was a little bit different to everyone. So I didn't really tell anyone that I was interested in this work. I kind of was like, okay, let's just do the one job that, is a sort of corporate, just to kind of tick the box so that, then they can leave me alone, because then I can say I've tried this already and it's not working for me. So, yeah.
So what is a day at the Story Factory? What do you do?
Yeah, that's a great question. What do I do? There's a lot. Like, I've been at the Story Factory now for the last 3.5 years, and a lot's happened. That's been during the pandemic as well. And so, no 2 days at the Story Factory are the same. I'll firstly say that, Kath Keenan, one of our co-founders, has done a really amazing job at hiring some really amazingly passionate and really talented staff. So I get to walk into work every day and meet kind of some of the best people I've ever worked with as well. And I think that makes such a big difference to how you perform in your work when you are surrounded by people who are passionate, who are caring. And as much as we all care a lot about the kids and what we are able to support them to do, we care about each other. And I think from that, I also get to come to work as myself. I think this is the first place where I get to be me, and I have my quirks, and and I get to kind of go, okay, I'm interested in doing this, or I have ideas for different things, and I get to test that out. So I think there's a great culture of support and supporting us to do the things that we think will work. So my job is about finding volunteers to come into Story Factory to work alongside our kids. And so, during the pandemic, it was definitely difficult. During that time, we moved online. We had a lot of people who were interested in hopping online into our programs. But then we kind of came back to in-person. And I think over the last year or the last 6 months or so, the cost of living has increased. And so that's obviously affected people. Grandparents are now carers for grandkids, people are going back to the workforce, and so the pool of volunteers is a lot smaller. So I've had to kind of, think outside the box about how do we engage people, and Story Factory lets me do whatever I think could work with getting volunteers through the door.
How do you recruit them? How do you go out today now?
Yeah.
Where do you start?
So tomorrow, actually, I'm going out to university to kind of like interact with students and get students there. Next month, I've got another event called the Festival of Creativity. So we're going to a lot of events. We were most recently at the Sydney Writers' Festival as well. And so we had a stall there called Prescription Poetry, where our team were kind of handing out prescriptions to people, and that's how people learned about the Story Factory.
Geez, you're good. You're good.
As a team, we are.
But Barnaby's got a question for you now.
Yes.
Thank you, TWEE. Well, actually, I don't have a question. I just need to thank you for coming in. Heart of a Lioness, THUY Giang, thank you so much for joining us. It was really nice hearing your incredible story. That was our last interview for Season 6, but once again, we'd like to thank the ARA Group for being our major sponsor for the 6th year in a row. Thank you also to the Sydney Swans for letting us use your incredible media room at the Swans HQ in Moore Park. It was really generous of Tom Harley and Loretta Johns to offer the space to record our podcast, and we can't thank you enough. Thank you to all of our incredible guests for being so generous with your time and wisdom. It was an honour and a really enjoyable experience chatting to all of you. And thank you for listening. We really hope we've helped you appreciate that just being an everyday Joe bag of donuts is good enough.
Or Joanne.
Or Joanne, of course. If you want to find out more about this show, go to the Everyday Greatness page at www.barnabyhowarth.com.au or follow us on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube or LinkedIn. Thanks again for listening this year, and we hope you can join us again next season.